Good morning to everyone, or good afternoon, depending on what time zone you're in. Thank you so much for joining us today for this presentation on the other quadrants. Precious, thank you for the introduction. I'm going to introduce myself and the other panelists who are going to be presenting today, and then we're going to jump right in. So my name is Adele Fontanet. I am the Director of the Tribal Justice Exchange at the Center for Court Innovation. I'd like to also introduce Medina Henry, who's the Director of the Community Justice Initiatives at the Center for Court Innovation, Karen Otis, who's the Associate Director of our Treatment Court Programs in our Technical Assistance Department, and Dave Lucas, who's also a Senior Program Manager from our Treatment Court Programs. So today, we're going to be talking about the other quadrants. As Precious mentioned earlier in her introduction, in healing to wellness courts, we are generally working with high risk, high needs populations, or at least we're supposed to be. And that's because we're providing really intensive programming. However, for any number of reasons, a lot of times we are tempted to work with other populations that aren't high risk and high need. Maybe that's because you have other folks who are coming in with substance use charges or substance use related charges, and you want to have an opportunity to provide an intervention or meaningful support to them. Or maybe that's because in our tribal court, our Healing to Wellness Court program is our best established program in terms of providing meaningful interventions, support, supervision, monitoring. You have this wonderful cohort of staff that are well trained and really prepared to provide a meaningful intervention around substance use disorder related issues. However, because these individuals aren't high risk and high need, they don't really fit into the treatment court model. So in this presentation today, we're going to delve deeper into the other quadrants. What would it look like for our Healing to Wellness Court programs to provide interventions and meaningful programming to folks who are in these other quadrants? Our hope is that this presentation is going to be valuable both for Healing to Wellness courts that are about to get up and running. You're getting started with the implementation phase, and maybe you want some ideas or suggestions on how to create different tracks for working with folks from other quadrants. But that this presentation can also be helpful to people who have really established Healing to Wellness courts, but you're looking to expand your circle of eligibility to people who are maybe not high risk and high need, but you still want to provide relevant and appropriate interventions for them in ways that really meet them where they're at and don't provide programming that's too intensive. So let's get started. Okay. So in this presentation, we're going to go over a few things. We're going to start by talking about risk and need, because you can't really talk about the other quadrants without getting an understanding of the risk and need principles and how we've created this quadrant so that we can structure programming around it. Then we're also going to go a bit into the theory of the quadrant, and then we're going to do a walkthrough of each of the four quadrants. We're going to provide you some examples, suggestions for what programming could look like. We're going to have you think about considerations or ideas you want to keep in mind as you're constructing programming for each of these quadrants. And then we're going to provide you some extra resources so when you guys get back with your teams, you can really have a host of ideas to take back with you when you're constructing different tracks. And then we're going to end with a final note on resilience. And that's because when we talk R&R, too often, resilience is an afterthought, but really resilience is the heart of what makes R&R effective. So we want to end with a note on resilience so we can think about how to be resilient throughout the process in working with our program. Okay, let's get started. So risk. Risk is in the model. Risk really tells us who to target. When we're talking about risk, we're generally talking about risk of reoffending. You may have heard risk in different contexts if you've worked with different types of tools. Like if you're in court, maybe at the pretrial phase, Sometimes risk can also mean like failure to appear. If you're working with in DV cases, sometimes you could be talking about risk of homicide if we're using lethality assessments. But when we're talking about R&R theory, risk is really about risk of reoffending or risk of committing a new crime or risk of rearrest. And the risk principle is going to tell us who we're targeting. It's going to tell us if we're going to be, if somebody is high risk or low risk of committing a new crime or being rearrested for a new crime. And what that means is, keep in mind, risk is not, these risk predictions, they are not fortune tellers. They don't tell the future. You can't, when someone is high risk, we're not saying this person is going to commit a new crime or be arrested for a new crime, only that they are at a higher likelihood of committing a new offense or committing a new crime. And the same with lower risk. They are less likely to commit a new crime. The need principle. So the need principle is going to tell us what to target with these individuals. When we're talking about need, we're not talking just about providing services, even though that's really helpful and that's part of what we're trying to do when we're working with clients and participants. But the need principle is actually really focusing on addressing people's underlying criminogenic needs. And criminogenic needs are needs that are strongly correlated with risk. So if we address some of these underlying criminogenic needs, we can actually reduce a person's risk of reoffending. And that's really what we're looking to do in our programming. As I wanted to highlight, not all of the things that we think of as supportive services correlate with criminogenic needs, but they're also still very important. And that's because when we're talking about responsivity, sometimes there are barriers for people to access meeting their underlying needs. So for example, most tools these days are now considering homelessness to be a responsivity factor. And that's because often when you provide somebody who is an unsheltered relative or who has unstable housing, if we provide them with a stable housing support, that may not necessarily reduce the likelihood that they're going to commit a new crime. But we have to provide support for that underlying issue in order to ask them to go to a GED class or to go to frequent treatment appointments or to go back to school. We have to really address this underlying responsivity need to enable them to address their criminogenic needs. Other examples of responsivity issues are mental health, are providing programming in an appropriate language so a person can understand. It could be thinking about somebody's childcare needs so that they can actually attend their programming. Responsivity is really what we need to think about when we think about how are we going to intervene? Where do we meet people where they're at so that our interventions, when we work to address their needs, are effective and meaningful, and we can use those to reduce their risk of reoffending. Okay, so what if we don't use R&R? Most healing to wellness courts are required by grant funding to use them, but I recognize that for any number of reasons, people may not want to use R&R tools, or maybe you'll say, I can eyeball it, I can figure out somebody's risk, I know their family history, whatever. The problem with not using R&R when we're creating meaningful, tailored programming for individuals is, in our best case scenario, we aren't providing people with the highest needs with the most intensive resources. So we're just kind of wasting our resources. We're putting people who don't really need to be somewhere in our more intensive tracks, or we're overlooking the people who really could use this intensive programming. So we're just not being effective in our allocation of resources. And we recognize, working in healing wellness courts, that resources are scarce. And we just don't have enough to go around for everybody. So we want to be really thoughtful and intentional about how we use our programming, so we're putting the right people in the right programs to create the best outcomes for them. And that's our best case scenario. In our worst case scenario, actually what we are doing is we are putting people in an inappropriate level of supervision or inappropriate treatments that aren't going to help them and could in fact be very harmful. They could in fact increase the likelihood that a person will now recidivate more than if you had done nothing. So let's dive into this because this is actually a very important point to make. Okay, so when we're talking about the risk principle, when we have higher risk individuals, we want to provide them more intensive interventions. This population responds better than other populations to more intensive treatment, meeting services needs, and more intensive supervision. When we're looking at a lower risk population, when we start putting them in more intensive interventions, what we actually find is that they start failing at higher rates. Why is that? Well, that's because people who are low risk, even though they may be involved in the criminal justice system, they have other supports and other things that are going well in their life. And when we start putting them in intensive services, what we're doing is we're forcing them to pick between going to school and going to their treatment mandate, or between taking care of their family responsibilities and going to their looking for employment classes. And so in these situations, what we're actually doing is we're forcing people to pick between failing at something in their lives. They're either going to fail our mandates or they're going to fail at obligations that we really want them to be successful in their lives. And that's really not what we want. Other consequences of putting lower risk people in higher, more intensive programming is that they're going to increase their contact with higher risk peers. So now they're part of programs of people who have been in and out of the criminal justice system many times, who may have access to more resources to be engaged in criminogenic behavior. They may introduce them to people, introduce them to more substances. That's also really not what we want. We could also unintentionally stigmatize individuals by putting them into programming that carries a lot of social stigma. And this is a point I really want to hammer in. Sometimes in our more intensive programs, we use incarceration as a sanction, and that can be problematic. But in this particular case, when we are working with low risk individuals and we're putting them in situations where they have to pick between doing things in their lives and meeting their mandates, and let's say they fail their mandates because they want to meet their family or personal obligations, we may use jail as a sanction. And using jail as a sanction with low risk populations is very, very harmful. This will actually increase their likelihood of recidivating. Let's talk about that more. So this is a host of studies, but there are actually a lot of studies that are supporting this at this point that show with different lengths of time, putting people in jail, whether it be for 30 days, whether it be for 2 weeks, or whether it be for 2 days. Any amount of time in jail results in increasing the likelihood that someone will reoffend. And the effects are strongest in the low risk population. So if we are taking low risk individuals and we are putting them in more intensive mandates, and it may result in jail time for them, we are actually increasing their likelihood of committing more crimes in the future, more than if we have just left them alone. That is not what we want in our program. I also want to point out that this is true not just in pretrial incarceration, this is also true in our programs. So this is a study of 400 drug court participants in New York City, and they found that when they put low risk participants in intensive long-term residential program, it actually doubled their likelihood of rearrest, as opposed to if they had not put these individuals in that programming. So this is the opposite of what we want in our programs. Our programs are designed and catered to intervene meaningfully and supportively in people's lives to help connect them to services, connect them to resources, help them on their path to recovery, to wellness. And if we are putting low-risk people in high-intensity intervention programming, we are doing the opposite. There's another study here done from federal pretrial, and it found that low-risk defendants were more likely, when they were put in intensive pre-trial supervision programming, were more likely to recidivate than high-risk defendants. Again, this is the opposite of what we want. We never want our people who are low risk to be performing worse than people who are high risk. That means we are doing something wrong, which we don't want to do. We want to create programming that is appropriately tailored so that we meet people where they at. If somebody is low risk, we are providing just the right amount of interaction, of support, of services, and then no more, because that person will be better with less. Whereas if somebody is higher risk, that's when we're going to save our intensive programming to provide supervision, services, and support at a higher level for that person. Okay, what does all of this mean when we're talking about R&R tools with Indigenous populations? I don't want to spend too much time talking about this because actually we're going to spend a lot of time talking about this tomorrow, but I think there are some important things to highlight. So I do want to give some honorable mentions, things that if you aren't already aware of, I think it would be helpful to be aware of, to just keep in the back of your mind as you're using your R&R tools. And again, we'll go much deeper into this tomorrow. Okay, I don't know if any of you guys saw this or if you remember this, but in 2019, there was actually a case that went to the Canada Supreme Court, and it was an Indigenous individual who was on parole, who was given very high mandates, and he actually sued and said, this tool does not understand me as an Indigenous person. These tools were not built for me. They don't reflect or understand my collective and individual needs, and I don't think it's accurate. I am being overclassified as higher risk than I am. And the Canada Supreme Court agreed. So you may be aware right now that there's a national debate that is playing out about risk need tools. It's really happening more in the arena of risk tools, but the issues can permeate into R&R theory as well. And the real controversy, for those who are not aware, is that tools are imperfect. Shocker. The tools are algorithms. They're based on mathematical algorithms that try to identify what somebody's risk level is, largely based on their history of criminal contact through the justice system. And because we live in a world where bias permeates decision-making, where people of color are over-policed, arrested at higher rates, are more likely to receive higher bail, and decision-making around sentencing, pretrial release, probation, and parole tends to skew to have a disparate impact to people of color. What we find is that the algorithms reproduce that. And so you can have an R&R tool that is likely to overclassify people of color as being higher risk than they are. I also want to highlight that there are studies, but the studies are mixed in terms of whether the outcomes are actually inequitable or whether they're actually more equitable. Some studies have found that because R&R tools reduce bias in decision-making, or at least guide it, that people are more likely to receive fair outcomes. Other studies have found the opposite. What does this mean for the use of R&R tools with tribal populations? We don't exactly know. We do know some things, and tomorrow we're going to delve much deeper into this. We did like a 2-year literature review. We've done our own research, and we will talk about that. Quick summary of what you're going to hear, though, is that Tools will always work better when they are built for a specific population or a specific locality. Most R&R tools have not been built using data from Native defendants, or if they have, they haven't really been studied specifically with Native or tribal populations. We suspect from the literature that these tools may also be overclassifying Native defendants, but we don't know. There are some tools that are being built for Natives and for tribal populations as we speak. Like I said, we'll talk more about that tomorrow. But why do I mention this now? Now you're probably like, oh, we're going to sit here using R&R tools and we're going to do all these quadrants. And now you're telling me, why? Maybe the tools are problematic. It is true. There is a lot more we need to know and learn about with the use of R&R tools with tribal populations. But the reason I tell you this is because, one, you should be aware of the controversy. You should be questioning it. You should be thinking about what it could mean with your population. And you should also be aware that when the tools make mistakes, they tend to overclassify people. So what that means, maybe somebody who's moderate risk, who's Native, might be viewed as high risk. We don't know, but we suspect. But, even with the understanding that R&R tools are imperfect, they are still better than blind judgment. You cannot implement a quadrant model without using R&R. Remember what I said our best and our worst case scenarios were? We really don't want to enter that worst case scenario where we are taking people who are low risk and we are putting them in our high intensity interventions because we are going to create situations where they start failing their mandates, where they start receiving sanctions, where we either ramp up supervision or fail them from their programs, which will in turn create a cycle of increasing their recidivism. That's not what we want. We want our courts to do the opposite. We want our courts to stop that revolving door and to meet people where they're at. And to do that, we need to use R&R tools. Okay, so let's talk about how do we set up these quadrants? How do we provide programming to people to meet them where they're at? I'm going to give you guys an overview, and then we're going to start digging deep into each of the quadrants to get a sense of what this looks like. So when we're talking high risk, high needs, this is the population and healing to wellness courts we're the most familiar with. These are individuals who have been in and out of the criminal justice system a few times. They have been identified as having substance use disorders, and they may have a host of other needs that need to get addressed in order to address their substance use disorder. This is the population that has historically been ideal for healing to wellness courts and drug treatment courts. On the other end, and we're going to go to the other end, we have low risk, low need people. These are individuals who may have come through the justice system once or twice. They don't have a lot of needs. And maybe sometimes we want to work with them, but we shouldn't. We should not. This is the population that when they come through our justice system, we should find ways to off-ramp them as soon as possible. And that is because this group will actually do better if you do nothing with them. If you do provide some services or programming, it should really be light touch. And we'll give you some examples of what that could look like. All right, now we're moving in to one of our other quadrants, low risk, high need. In my experience, I think this is the category of people that is most likely to get pulled into healing wellness courts when they shouldn't be. And that is because these are individuals who maybe they've had brief contact with the criminal justice system, but they're coming in with substance use disorder charges. And once we screen or assess them, we're identifying that they have a lot of needs. And there's a desire to want to work with this population because, like I said, maybe you have a great program and you're like, we can connect people to all of these services. It's going to be a great intervention. This is a good fit. This is the population that like I said, I think there's a temptation to pull them up into our intensive track in healing to wellness court, and we shouldn't be. But if we are going to create a track for them, there are still ways that we can work with them. And we're going to talk about what it would look like to work with this particular population in this quadrant. Then the last quadrant we're going to talk about is high risk, low need. This is a complicated population, and we're going to go into why they're complicated. On a whole, though, these are individuals who have maybe a pretty lengthy criminal history, but when we assess them, their flagging is really low on needs. So with this population, we want to think about how to provide structure and supervision and maybe some behavioral health supports or behavioral health like CBT, MRT. We'll go into it. But like I said, this is a bit more of a complicated population. So now that we've had an overview of where we're going, let's think about delving deeper into a 4-quadrant court model. What would that look like to create separate tracks for individuals at different risk and need levels so that we can meet our clients where they're at without increasing their risk, and in fact, actually provide supportive, tailored, and appropriate interventions to help reduce their risk of recidivism in the future. And I'm handing it over to Dave.
Okay, thank you so much, Adele, and good morning and good afternoon to everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Okay, so let's just start off with the quadrant that we're most familiar with. And that's the quadrant rather than the other quadrants. And that's the folks that score high risk and high need. As we know, this group is considered the target population for more intensive court supervised programming. Adele has gone through the reasons why. Models like healing to wellness courts, drug courts, mental health courts, certain hybrid courts, and the research is really clear. Treatment courts that work with high risk, high need populations are twice as effective as those serving lower risk participants, both in terms of reducing overall community costs and reducing recidivism rates, twice as effective. And that's partly because, as we know, and as we've talked about already a little bit, without some kind of meaningful intervention, this group is likely to keep cycling in and out of the system, the courts, shelters, detox, hospitals, jails. Bottom line, the mechanics of longer term and resource-rich models work better for those with higher criminogenic scores and more serious substance use and mental health concerns. Of course, this group shouldn't be considered more dangerous or a bigger threat to community safety by any stretch. This score simply means that in order to break the cycle that they're in, a treatment court primary high-risk, high-need track needs to provide a comprehensive response, heavy on services, and more structured and intentional supervision. And I like to say structured and intentional supervision instead of intensive, because sometimes intensive just means strict and frequent and lots and overbearing. And we don't necessarily always need that. We just need structure and intention. So I'm trying to shift that language a little bit as much as I can. Now, as far as clinical suitability, which is a big slice of the criminogenic score, this is a bit trickier. This is not as easily defined as legal suitability. Categorizing substance use and mental health is obviously more complicated than reviewing the nature of one's charges or criminal history. These categories are evolving fields, and the etiology of addiction is especially complex and not entirely agreed upon even today. So in the very least, we want to make sure that our courts are using validated tools, as Adele pointed out, to help ensure that our personal biases aren't clouding these decisions too much. Now, of course, again, no tool is perfect, and most tools, maybe all tools, have their own baked-in biases. So we want to be using these just as a baseline, especially, you know, and we want to adapt them to account for local trends and conditions as much as we can. So for example, what we don't want to do when using these tools is to assume that a person's visibility to law enforcement is what makes their substance use or mental health aka criminogenic needs, seem more severe than they are. Getting arrested in relation to one's drug use, for example, is definitely a problem. It qualifies as a disruption of daily life, but it does not necessarily mean the person has a substance use disorder. It only means two things. They've been arrested and they use drugs. A 6-year-old man who lives in supportive housing, gets his meals at the food pantry, and smokes crack a few times a month is technically breaking the law and maybe isn't the most healthy person, but that doesn't necessarily qualify as a substance use disorder, make him high risk, high need, or make him a good fit for your average healing to wellness court. It's possible that most of his life is in order, and assuming that most of his use is done in private, he's not affecting the community that much. So we really want to watch our instinct to widen the net and overassign people to the high risk category. We want to find other solutions for that group, as Adele mentioned. Next slide, please. Now, in terms of supporting this high risk, high need group, the focus of a court's intervention needs to be on the whole person. We can't leave anything out, and we know this, and I think the healing to wellness field knows this maybe even better than a lot of other treatment court models. So if our court is only comprised of a well-intentioned judge and some local 12-step meetings and a veteran coordinator, that is not nearly enough. We really need the Cadillac of services for this population: evidence-based, trauma-focused treatment, a sense of history, a sense of local culture, low barrier, multiple pathways and modalities, easy to access addiction medicine, housing options, not just sober housing, but actual decent housing options, school and work opportunities. And we also have to put extra effort into the bookends of our care, the beginning and the end of the journey. In other words, we address their immediate safety and survival needs up front, especially in this overdose crisis. And then over time, we support them as they rebuild their social and cultural world and long-term recovery plan. Without these things, we simply can't justify the expectations that we put on this population. And if our court doesn't have access to these resources, well, join the club. Most courts don't have all of them, but you should be working towards, as much as possible, working towards accessing those. Because otherwise, all we're really doing is intensive supervision. And that, as Adele has mentioned, for certain populations, especially if we're not working always with the ideal population, can do more harm than good. Next slide, please. And here's another way to kind of look at that issue. And one of kind of the trappings, I think, that treatment courts sometimes fall into, especially when there's a lot of service gaps. So on the left, we have what's called the acute model of care. This intervention treats addiction and mental health and criminogenic risk, kind of like a broken leg. The problem is framed biomedically. The clinician is the expert, the response is targeted and time limited, and any kind of treatment failure is understood to be the patient's fault. On the right, however, we have a recovery management approach, and I heard on the agenda there's going to be another presentation on recovery management at this conference, so I definitely recommend checking that out. But this approach treats substance use disorder like a chronic recurring condition with multiple causes, many of which are systemic, and similarly multiple pathways towards recovery. And so what we want to avoid doing in the urgency of our work and out of habit is stacking up a bunch of acute care interventions over 18 months and calling it a long-term strategy. The high risk, high need folks are wily veterans of half-hearted, brief interventions with no follow-up. It's why building back up trust in the system, or maybe even just for the first time, is such a huge part of working with this high risk, high need population. Next slide. And so thank you, and to truly flip the script on how this high risk, high need population receives care, we want to do the opposite of the emergency room approach. We want to slow down, take advantage of the time we have, make sure our treatment plans have client buy-in, and in fact, are centering client buy-in. We want to honor any mistrust or hesitancy that we see in our clients. A lot of it is justified. We look for ways that our clients have survived. We take recovery into community spaces, and we understand that treatment failures are often indicative of system-wide failures. If we don't do this, especially with this group, then we're not really offering much different than what they've encountered in the past as they move through the system. And I think I'm going to pass it over to Medina to talk about the next quadrant. Thank you.
Thanks, Dave. Greetings, everyone. So we're going to zoom in. You see our lovely grid. We're going to zoom in on appropriate responses for low risk and low need individuals who appear in this quadrant. Next slide, please. As Adele said, these individuals are unlikely to recidivate or have further encounters in the criminal justice system. And so we really want to create responses that off-ramp them as soon as possible. We don't want them to be in groups with more high risk or high need individuals. Those interactions can lead to worse encounters and also can be disruptive to the pro-social activities that they have in their life, education and employment. So really quickly, we want to release off-ramp as soon as possible, limit the justice system involvement for these individuals. The interventions should be brief and small. In summary, less is more. I'm going to talk about a couple of examples of programming and our community court models that often see low risk, low need individuals and some of the tailored responses that have been developed. Next slide, please. So the center developed this pre-arraignment diversion program in 2015. Project Reset diverts people out of the justice system with proportionate, restorative, and effective responses to low-level offenses. Prosecutors screen eligibility and refer cases to Reset staff. So the project offers art-based programming or museum-based programming led by teaching artists. They also offer restorative circles and individual counseling sessions. In these sessions, participants reflect on the underlying issues that led to their arrest and how to avoid future contact with the justice system. Engagement lasts anywhere from 2 to 4 sessions. All participants are offered voluntary referrals to community-based social services. We're seeing adaptations in other jurisdictions looking to develop a track for low risk, low need individuals. The engagement period is very short, and any other services that are flagged or come up in conversation or assessment are only voluntary. Next slide, please. In the community court model, there are often a variety of interventions that are used for low risk, low need individuals that are in the court. Oftentimes there are individual or case management sessions. Those are also relatively short. They're usually centered around sort of processing the experience and also identifying any needs that might be presented. But all of that, again, is only to connect to voluntary services and have that person's encounter be very short and very brief. There also are a menu of group classes that are available that are often very short, no more than 2 sessions. For example, there's one that centers around the power of women. It's a 2-day group facilitated by a local community partner, and women are given the opportunity to discuss gender-specific issues related to health, family, and relationships, job readiness. These groups help to provide concrete skills and aid to the job process, but really, really short, succinct guidance and information so a person can show up for their group session, complete it and be done and move on with their time with the court. Another key component that is really helpful for a low risk, low need population is thinking through meaningful community service engagements. In our community courts, we often see examples of partnering with local community gardens, food banks. One of our jurisdictions also has started doing preparation of naloxone kits. All of that is no more than a couple of hours of community service. They're all meaningful engagements in community service, and that person's intervention and engagement in the justice system ends there and doesn't continue on. I think I'm going to pass it on to Dave now for another example.
Thanks, Medina. So, yeah, not much to add, but I think just from a clinical perspective, that just because this interaction is going to be a really brief one, a very light touch, that doesn't mean that it has to be light on impact. As the graphic here suggests, this kind of intervention is where we really get to plant the seeds in the most low pressure way possible. In all likelihood, we are likely working with almost no legal leverage with this population, which can kind of be great because it keeps that interaction and our intentions really honest. So if you're a service provider contracted by the court or a probation officer even, the kinds of things that we might say to clients in these cases are, you know, hey, we're here if you need us in the future. We would love to see you again if you think we could help. Call us if it seems like things are starting to spiral and unravel, or you're worried about getting arrested maybe. You know, don't forget I know your story now. So if you ever need anything, you won't have to start from the beginning, all that kind of good stuff. But as Medina mentioned, the point here is that we want to make a mark and we don't want to overtreat. We don't want to ensnare them in another system unless that's something that they're getting benefit from. And the helping professions of which I'm a part of aren't always the best at that. We're not always the best at stepping back. So even with the best of intentions, it's often too much or nothing at all. So to avoid that, we want to focus in on filling gaps, addressing immediate risks like overdose risk, safer using practices. If somebody's engaged in sex work, even addressing the risks and ways to do that safer, even if those are uncomfortable conversations. And then, you know, basically just getting folks back on stable ground and out of the system. So on the slide here is a list of services we can offer to clients, things that folks can really benefit from, but also ways that we can help to measure a client's engagement or compliance to satisfy the court. So it's kind of a win-win. This list of units of engagement comes from the overdose avoidance and recovery court model. There's a couple of these throughout New York City. And as you can see, all of these things have the potential to lead to more voluntary interactions in the future. They're educational in nature. So in that sense, they feel voluntary. They don't feel overbearing. So hopefully it leads to more. Things like connecting with a peer, getting a housing referral, getting your ID back, or health benefits turned back on. These can be game changers to just get somebody who's just fallen off a little bit, needs to get back on track. And so if this person ever needs support in the future, you know, we've let them know that they can come to us for these little things. And I think that's kind of the key with these interventions, at least from a clinical perspective. And I think I'm going to pass the mic to Karen.
Yes, thanks, Dave. So before I get started, I want to thank you all again for having us here. And the chat is starting to bubble up a little bit, so please feel free to drop your conversations in the chat. If you have a Q&A, your questions and answers, you can put them in that section, and we'll try to get to them near the end. And if we can answer them quickly, we'll jump on that, but we're trying to hold off because we want to see if we can address some of your questions throughout the presentation. So let's talk about the other quadrant, the high risk, low needs quadrant. And that represents individuals that are at a greater risk to recidivate, as Adele had mentioned, but they have lower needs. They tend to be employed, they may have housing, and they also may have some sort of social support network. They have protective factors around them or available to them. So their substance use tends to be heavy and contributes to their involvement in the criminal justice system. However, they may not identify themselves as having a substance use disorder, and it may not be picked up when they do a diagnostic test on that. Also, and they might not connect their use to their criminality. A high risk, low needs track would need to focus on high supervision and monitoring, criminogenic thinking, and a behavioral change. And with that, it's a suggested 200 hours of an intervention that includes cognitive behavioral therapy. The intervention should also include pro-social building to orient participants' knowledge and gain understanding and adaptive problem solving, because problem solving is key with this population. And when designing a high risk, low needs track, participants should have frequent court appearances bi-weekly initially, in the same vein that we would do it with a high-risk high-needs population, and it should be in front of a judge. Additionally, any non-compliance should be addressed swiftly, again, in the same way we do with our high-risk high-needs population. And since these participants have some pro-social skills and some protective factors, it's really important to properly assess and reassess their needs. It's really crucial because you want to ensure that proportional individualized treatment planning is occurring. Their low needs can change to moderate or high needs if the criminogenic behaviors persist. And so we want to alleviate that. They don't have to attend rehab. They don't have to attend intensive outpatient treatment when it comes to substance use interventions. So lower intensive outpatient substance use disorder treatment or psychoeducational groups about substance use disorder is recommended until assessed in a higher level is deemed necessary. Next slide, please. Great, thank you. So on this slide, you'll see a few high-risk, low-needs interventions, and they include the following: motivation for change, moral recognition therapy, which some of you may be familiar with. Treatment courts use that a great deal. Thinking for a change, anger management, interactive journaling, and community reinforcement approaches. And these are just a few CBT interventions used in treatment courts or in the field. All of these interventions, except for CRA, use some form of manualized curriculum to help facilitate behavioral change. And all of these interventions focus on criminal thinking, criminal attitudes, beliefs, values, and behaviors. Most of the interventions require a trained facilitator, and the training can vary from the amount of time to become trained under that intervention. And one note, when working with manualized curriculum, we should be mindful of a participant's reading level when identifying treatment options, especially when working with manualized curriculum. So let's go through and talk a little bit about each of these interventions. Motivation for change is a prerequisite intervention that identifies a participant's state of change regarding their criminal behavior, substance use, their attitudes, values, and beliefs. And it's suggested that this intervention be used before any of the other more intensive interventions. And so that being said, working with this population, there is some gain, and if you get them in a less intensive program that addresses the criminogenic thinking, the behaviors, substance use, and attitudes, you may be able to then steer them out of the criminal justice system. The next one is moral recognition therapy. It is a 12 to 16 week session, open intervention, which means that there's rolling admission. People come in at different times and they're at different points in different sessions or different stages in the intervention. And moral recognition therapy asks individuals to think about the level of their social rules, how important in making decisions concerning social rules and how important they are to change their behaviors. The individual works in a group setting and they pass from step to step based on the group members' feedback. So the groups vote, the group as a whole votes on an individual to step to the next phase. Thinking for a change is much more intensive. It's 25 sessions, and this is a closed intervention. This is really important for someone to be in thinking for change, that's a much higher intensity level. And this program focuses on developing problem-solving skills and identifying what participants tell themselves to justify breaking the law. And the intervention provides steps to follow on how to manage problems before they become unmanageable. The next one is anger management, and lots of programs use anger management at different levels. Generally, it's 8 to 12 weeks intervention, and it combines relaxation, cognitive behavioral work, and communication skills. And anger management can be open and it can be closed. It depends. We also have interactive journaling, which incorporates positive, lasting changes through motivational interviewing and the trans-theoretical model of behavioral change. They use structured, expressive writing and cognitive behavioral therapy. And then the final one is community reinforcement approach, which helps participants engage in healthy, adaptive behaviors that provide rewarding feelings that they can then potentially compete with the rewarding feelings they were getting from their substance use without the negative consequences. And role play is a big tool in this intervention. Next slide, please. So we've learned a lot of lessons to dealing with high-risk, low-needs populations from our experience with DUI courts. In DUI courts, the participants tend to score lower or moderate on R&R tools based on the static factors. And so they've actually developed special DUI R&R tools to address that. We know that individuals who drink and drive, and generally that's how they're arrested, do so in higher rates compared to the number of actual arrests that actually occur. So that definitely impacts their risk score, because the static factor of the number of arrests is contributory toward the risk score. Low needs participants in DUI courts tend to see themselves not as like others in the criminal justice system, and they tend to not see themselves as needing substance use disorder treatment, at least at the real intense level. And to some degree, they may not. However, it is still a factor because it's contributory to their criminality. So when clients other themselves, then it makes it much harder to get them connected to services that they need. In DUI court, the legal leverage tends to be a loss of driving privileges. And so that can be problematic, because if clients are not able to drive and they have some of those other protective factors, as Adele mentioned, employment, et cetera, not having access to getting to work or transportation issues is problematic. So that can directly impact their needs and their protective factors. And as mentioned earlier, supervision and monitoring should be high with this population. So using monitoring devices like ignition interlock devices, alcohol monitoring bracelets, ETG, which is testing for alcohol in a different way than just a standard test, and frequent court appearance in front of the judge has been most beneficial. And so these participants should be assessed using evidence-based clinical assessments to identify substance use disorder, mental health, and trauma, because they potentially have underlying issues that may not be present when you first meet them. And so finally, there also must be a mechanism to reassess for a change in needs. Again, this population may present one way. They have employment, they have housing, they have, it looks like what it could be a stable family environment. But that is very tenuous based on their risky behavior and their criminogenic factors. So that being said, I'm going to hand it off to Dave, because he's going to talk more about this high-risk, low-needs population.
Okay, thanks, Karen. So again, I don't have a whole lot to add here, but I do want to just touch on those rare but really interesting cases where a client presents as high risk, low need, but over time, we learn that their needs are actually far greater and more complex than they first appeared. Anybody in this field knows that it's not uncommon for people to underreport their personal challenges, especially those related to their mental health or drug use. It's not uncommon for people to underreport their trauma or grief because they haven't explored it, it's too painful, or they just haven't had support before. So if we get the sense that we're learning more about a person's clinical or social needs, we should probably reassess and consider a change to the treatment plan. Maybe we sneak in a family of origin exercise to learn a little bit more about their family background. Maybe there's some internalized shame that is deep-seated that they haven't even explored, and it's been there since, for decades. Now, if we do get some new salient information in that work, that doesn't mean that we sound the alarm bells and immediately ramp up supervision, as this could push the person away, especially if we've just kind of strengthened that alliance with this person and built some trust. It might just require a subtle shift in the clinical approaches that we're using, away from entirely behavior focused towards something that's a little bit more trauma based and even psychodynamic if you've got that skill set in your team. Now, at the other end of the spectrum are the folks that have been around legal activity for so long that they're actually quite high functioning within that context at least, but would really struggle in a mainstream work or school setting. In that world, they present as higher needs, like likely experiencing low self-efficacy, a lack of belonging, self-esteem, a lot of internalized shame. So while they might know how to play the courts game and seem kind of high functioning on that front, their capacity to transition away from legal activity in the long run might be quite limited. So again, there's often more than meets the eye with this group. We want to make sure that we don't put all the emphasis on compliance when someone is actually struggling with an array of social health challenges that they've learned to keep under wraps. So again, as I think Adele mentioned, maybe this probably will make up a very, very small proportion of the folks that you'll see in healing to wellness courts. But you know, those cases where this person is so challenging, I just can't figure it out. This might be the person. This might be the person that's got something that you just haven't explored yet because you made a decision about kind of what quadrant they fit into. So maybe take a look at it from this perspective. It might open some things up. And we might learn a little bit more than we first realized. Next slide, please. And again, as Adele mentioned earlier, the quadrant that we're much more likely to see present in a healing to wellness court setting is this low risk, high need group. People in this group have limited criminal histories, if any, but do have significant treatment needs, social needs, and often lack basic material resources like housing and income stability. The research tells us that this group is likely to desist from criminal activity if their social needs are met in meaningful ways, and importantly, if they're kept separate from treatment court participants with more extensive criminal histories. I don't like the language of peer contagion. It makes it seem like people with criminal histories are diseased in some way, and so I want to move away from that. However, the needs are different, the culture is different, even the way of moving through systems is different, and this research is pretty clear and kind of reinforces our intuition that when these two groups are together, things don't go well for that lower risk group in the long run. So we want to keep them kind of separate in terms of their court appearances. If possible, we want to keep them in different treatment groups if possible. It doesn't necessarily mean that they can't be together. We know in the history of mutual aid, people from all walks of life have shared church basements and you know, drank crummy coffee and plastic chairs and got along with each other despite their background. So we know that it's not a situation where it's always going to get contaminated based on background. But in the court setting, we want to try to keep these things different. Part of this is because we want to keep the optics consistent. And we also want to make sure that the handling of the case is consistent with the risk level. Without a separate track and without formalizing this intention, the tendency is for low risk clients to get kind of rounded up, to be treated like their higher risk counterparts. And the research shows, as we've said, this produces the exact opposite outcomes that we're trying to get, namely increased criminal activity. And I'm going to pass the mic to, I think it's Medina.
That's right. Hello again. So I wanted to spend some time talking through some community court interventions for this population. So programming and intervention ideas that you all might consider. So these recommendations are often tangible and often connected to essential needs, such as obtaining legal ID, social security cards, enrolling in SNAP benefits, programming and groups that are offered are, again, really short term. Oftentimes, case management sessions can be 2 to 4 sessions. Those services in the case management sessions, they work with individuals to identify goals, link clients to community resources to meet those goals, and explore motivation for change. The sessions are typically 30 minutes to an hour. While the sessions can have a therapeutic impact, it's not a substitute for individual therapy or treatment, but to help individuals with the idea and the process of a treatment program down the line if an individual should pursue that. But again, these individuals may be presenting with a lot of needs, but the goal here is to connect them to services voluntarily, but not in the formal high intensity treatment planning that you would see in a drug court or healing to wellness court. So some examples of groups that are offered in this community court intervention can be a group for individuals that might flag with mental health needs. This is intended to challenge the stigma or misinformation that could prevent individuals from seeking mental health treatment. It helps to give definitions and an overview of how diagnosis and symptoms present. A second group that's offered has to do with coping and consequences. So that's designed to motivate and empower participants to address their own needs and outline what options are available for them in terms of services. And another example would be a group on basic financial literacy, budget techniques. These are all groups that really center around some very core essential social service needs, helping people to identify and understand the systems that they may need to connect with. While there is oftentimes a well-intentioned desire to build a robust treatment plan for low-risk, high-need individuals, this could be more harmful. So using and leveraging the service hub and resources that are connected to the court as a way of voluntarily accessing support services for these individuals is the name of the game here. So really allowing people to connect to the services that they need on their own terms, but not making them a mandate or part of the formal treatment plan for these individuals. Let's turn to another example for low risk, high need interventions. Next slide, please. ESPER is a promising new strategy that has an adaptation for tribal youth. It's being used in a variety of youth serving systems, including juvenile justice settings, to identify signs of mental health, substance use issues, and briefly intervene to clarify the severity, progression, and motivation of youth and families to follow up on treatment referrals when necessary. So this is, a more holistic approach. It's something that is specifically adapted for tribal youth. And again, understanding that as youth are part of a family unit and there are cultural implications. And so while there aren't many tools that are often adapted for a tribal context, this one happens to be a model that has been. So I'm going to stop here and hand over the mic to Dave.
Okay, so in some ways, this slide, at least to me, feels like the $1,000,000 question. How to engage clients when we have this reduced legal leverage? And the reason this is becoming an increasingly important question is because we've entered an era of sentencing reform, bail reform, drug decriminalization, formal and informal versions of that. And so with each passing piece of legislation across the country, treatment courts are needing to rely on other strategies to incentivize participation and retain clients, hold on to them, and make their participation valuable. Our work with this low risk, high needs group is very much the same. These folks aren't facing 2 years of jail if they don't follow the rules. So the threat of incarceration isn't looming the way it is for those in the high risk, high need quadrant. And that's good, but yet this group still has needs and they've still been ensnared in the system somehow. So they could still very much benefit from what we can offer, even if it's a shorter and lighter intervention. And the goal is really still to prevent future justice system exposure. That's the #1 thing. So how do we make that feel worthwhile? Well, it starts, and we've heard this language a couple times already. I think Karen mentioned it, and Adele, it starts by meeting clients where they're at and respecting their treatment goals, their process, their timeline for change. In other words, we will need to shift towards a harm reduction approach, which some people are in favor of, some people are a little nervous about, but that doesn't mean less care, and there's sometimes a misconception about that we're doing less. It just means more collaborative care, which is clinically actually more challenging. It's kind of easy to say the court wants you to do this, so you have to do it. You know what's really hard? Coming up with a collaborative treatment plan that everybody agrees on. So it's actually more work, and but it's also more rewarding. So it's more relational instead of relying on the court's directives, and client voice is more prominent in this kind of work. But just like high risk, high need, the services still need to be really, really high quality. The housing and the treatment options need to be good ones, not just the available ones. And as such, our system navigation work with this group has to be intentional, and it has to show results. We can't just say, call this number, they'll help you out. That doesn't retain clients because they can do that on their own. To keep clients with reduced leverage, not facing any kind of jail time, they've got to see their peers getting housed. They've got to see people getting their kids back. They have to see their peers in the program enjoying treatment, going on their own volition and coming out happy. Similarly, we need to get people with lived experience involved and fully integrate our peers, which includes paying them as much as we can. We also need to chill out when it comes to sanctioning every minor issue, because that's just not going to work with this group. It's not ethical, but it's also just not effective. And most importantly, we need to frame all of the work that they're doing toward improving their health, quality of life, and never ever getting caught up in the system again. It can be about abstinence if that's their goal, and that's, for some people, that's really important, and for other people it's about safer use, reduced use, and just never being in the system again. And that's the most realistic, positive outcome for those folks. And so we want to de-emphasize the criminality of their use and focus on the other kinds of risks associated with their use, and let them move towards the other kinds of consequences and other barriers their use creates on their own. And we're just ultimately moving towards conversations that are about their health, relationships, and broader life goals. And I think that's actually how you kind of keep people coming back. And that'll surprise them in a good way. They'll be like, I thought I had to just, pee in a cup and be abstinent. And if you talk about the other things, they'll come back, because it'll feel like a place that they can talk about the other things that are important to them. So again, this might feel like a subset of our target population, but they're probably not. And that could be for good or bad reasons, but either way, what we've learned is that this group is probably going to become a more relevant population in our work in the coming years. And so we really need to think about what, fundamentally motivates people to change in some new ways. The next slide, please. And so with that in mind, we return to the question at the beginning, why create separate tracks? And I think we've probably made this point clear, but when our interventions are more tailored, more scientific, less cookie cutter, we get better outcomes. We can also serve more people without worrying that we're over-treating, net widening, or doing more harm than good. But another reason is to help treatment courts evolve and adapt with the legal and cultural changes that are already underway and still to come. It gives us more credibility in adjacent fields like public health and the healthcare system, and in other academic circles that wonder if drug courts are evolving with the changing needs. And so I wanted to point the audience to some different court models and strategies that exist. These aren't necessarily tracks, but they are different models that we can learn from. Some are very new, so have limited research behind them, and some, like Hawaii's Hope, have been around for a while, but have some mixed findings. Even with mixed findings, I think that they're worth looking at for lessons as you think about how you could adapt your court with different populations. Maybe you'll look at the research and their model and say, oh, I can see why this isn't working, but we can make a change in how we apply this. So if each one listed there is a clickable link. So once you get our slides, you can click on those and it'll take you to some information. And the next slide, please. And just lastly, here are some further readings if you're interested. First two are from NDCI, who've written on alternative tracks. You'll be familiar with Doug Marlowe. He wrote the first and second pieces there. And then we've got shameless plugs here for CCI, 3 publications that are talking about how drug courts are evolving under sentencing reform. The court responses to the opioid epidemic sheds light on some different kind of pre-plea models that are focused on clinical stabilization. And then we've got the final one there, which is kind of like an op-ed piece about legal leverage and how to think about our work in more relational ways. And again, if you click on all those, it'll take you straight to the paper. Okay, I think that's it for me. And thanks again for listening. And I'll pass the mic to maybe Dell.
Yeah.
Oh, that's me.
Oh, Karen.
It's me. I just want to make a comment. We've been talking about the rant in the chat. And so I was trying to put a link in there, but I got sidetracked in trying to. So we'll try to share as much information about these proprietary, yes, the rant is proprietary, our tools as we go through, and or to add to the presentation at the end. We are getting really tight on time, and so I just want to jump really quickly into responsivity because we want to talk about resilience on the backside, because that is, as Adele said, really important. And so we've talked about the R of risk, we've talked about the N of need, but what tends to happen is that second R of responsivity tends to fall off the proverbial cliff. And so we want to make sure that we include that second R when we're doing our treatment planning. You know, criminogenic needs are really important to be addressed. And so they need to be addressed in the responsivity phase amongst others. And so we want to make sure that we're doing that, because what tends to happen is we have our score, we have our needs, and then what? We don't use them for treatment planning, and then it's a one size fits all approach, and it's not individualized, and that becomes problematic for the clients that we work with. So just want to ask yourself some questions when you're using your R&R tools. How are you using your R&R tool? Has the second R been lost? Has it fallen off the cliff? Are you using the results to develop the treatment plans for your clients, which is really, really important? Are you reassessing participants? Are you looking back at the identified needs during the reassessment phase to ensure that the needs are being met, or to change or address any needs that may have come up that you weren't aware of initially? And also, do participants have a voice in the assessment? Dave mentioned this a second ago. Treatment planning and reassessing, working with our clients from soup to nuts, from the time they walk in, clients should be a part of the process. Who better than the participant to know what their needs are and how they want and need to respond to those needs? And it's more likely that you're going to get a client to want to engage in services if they're part of the planning process. So include them in the intake, the assessment, and the reassessment phases to make sure that their voice is being heard. So I'm going to hand it over to Adele, and so we can talk about resiliency.
Thanks, everyone. I also want to apologize because I think I may have confused everyone by saying resilience, but I meant responsivity. Our tribal tool emphasizes resilience a lot, and so that is something we'll be talking about tomorrow. But I confused my R's in our R and R because we're adding another one. We just really like the R's, guys. So my apologies for that, but thank you, Karen, for that very important, not a note, but like thread reminder. It is what ties everything together, is the responsivity. Okay, so super quick review. When we're thinking about creating separate tracks, we want to sort our individuals. We want to keep our high risk people and high need people. We want to provide their intentional interventions thoughtfully, but we really don't want to bring in our lower risk people for those mandates that are going to be really more rigorous. We want to separate our low risk, low need people. I implore you, consider off-ramping those individuals. If you want to provide any intervention or programming, I mean light touch. I mean like a day of community service. I mean like a peacemaking circle. We want to think less is more with this group. With our low risk, high need, we want to think about light touch supervision and voluntary referral to services. We want to keep the things that are going well in their lives well, and we want to provide them the option to voluntarily pursue the services and the supports that are going to enhance their life, but we don't want to do it under a court mandate. And then our high risk, low need individuals are more complicated. We want to check in with those individuals. We want to consider reassessing those individuals in case there's anything we missed. But we want to consider our behavioral therapy intervention for them as well. We want to provide some quick links and resources. For those of you that aren't familiar with the ARC, it's a website that NEDCP put out. It's really cool. It's our grid, but you can click on it, and let's say you want some programming suggestions for your low risk, low need category. You'll click on low risk, low need, and it zooms over to the side, and you can pick at what point you want, like what intercept point you want programming for. I do want to mention that this website is newer and there's still populating resources. So you may click on, let's say, pre-trial resources or community correction resources, and you may not find as many as you were hoping for, but they will list some great evidence-based models. The last time I looked, I didn't see many tribal-specific programs, but again, it's a newer website. I imagine they're going to continue populating the website, so feel free to keep checking in on it. It's a great resource and place to get started with some ideas. I also want to let you know that we have a website at the Center for Court Innovation. It's called Tribal Access to Justice Innovation, but the link is just tribaljustice.org. And we profile a lot of amazing programs. Many of you have programs on our website that focus on a host of different interventions, but we have a whole webpage for substance use and recovery programming. It's going to highlight some healing to wellness courts that are doing more high risk, high need work, but it will also highlight other types of interventions and programs, youth-based programs, programs that connect individuals and youth with cultural engagements, cultural leaders, traditions, recovery programs. There's a whole host of resources. So feel free to go check that out if you're interested in getting some ideas that you might want to use in your different tracks. And we have the contacts from the tribal programs that developed it, so feel free to reach out to them, learn and share and collaborate from each other. And do we have time for questions? We've got 2 minutes. We're going to open up for questions for 2 minutes. But if we don't have time to get to your questions, please feel free to email us. We have a lot of other suggestions and things we could have shared. We'd love to chat with you more about this. So, do we have any questions? Okay. I think we might be ending on time. We tried to do our best to answer your questions as they came live. We hope we got to them all. But like I said, if we missed anything, please feel free to email us. We're going to provide a bunch of links and resources on the Healing to Wellness Court Enhancement website, so you'll be able to access those. Thank you, everyone.
Adele, there is a question. Are there sample sanction / incentive grids for other risk levels other than high risk, high need?
That's a great question.
I might be able to provide some samples from the community court context because most of those participants are often not eligible for drug courts.
Okay, great. Thank you, Medina. And all of the resources that our presenters talked about today, we will be getting them and also posting them to the virtual conference space as well as enhancementtraining.org. Thank you all for sharing your expertise and your knowledge. It's a really great stepping stone to tomorrow's plenary, talking about risk, need, responsivity. So thank you again. It's always nice seeing you guys. And yeah. So